Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, and this is just a quick commentary on different things. Particularly this is back on the subject of KJV onlyism, and I've given commentary on this subject before. This particular one has to do with marginal notes. A lot of KJV onlyists do not like the fact that a lot of modern Bibles, such as say the New King James, NIV, ESV, pretty much every major modern translation that is out there, except for the paraphrases, have marginal notes. And the accusation is oftentimes that the marginal notes destroy people's faith. And you can understand that concern, that if you're reading through the Bible and you have a little marginal notes, or you have a footnote or whatever it happens to be that says, well, some manuscripts say this, some manuscripts say that, or this is not found in the earliest manuscripts, so on and so forth. Especially if you don't know the history of the text and you don't know how everything works together, that could be a little bit disconcerting. I can understand where they're coming from on that one. However, for the King James onlyist, I find that to be an extremely inconsistent position, because the King James translators themselves included marginal notes. A lot of the marginal notes that they included were, say, references to other passages that had to deal with the subject at hand, and pretty much everyone is okay with that kind of a marginal note, a cross-reference. But they also included other marginal notes that are very important as well. For example, sometimes they would include marginal notes that had to do with alternate ways to translate things. In fact, I have a 1611 KJV. This is a facsimile edition that uses modern typeface, because the original KJV was, of course, printed in this Gothic font that hardly anyone could read. And so when they did the facsimile edition, they used modern type. And just to show you what it looks like, it's actually a very nice Bible. I have to admit that I like it quite a bit, and as a facsimile is concerned, and you can just kind of feel the history to a certain extent. It's great. And as you read through it, you'll notice that there are lots of those marginal notes that give alternate translations, and they usually begin with "or," and then they'll say this is the other way that you could translate that phrase, and they're always in the margins. And that actually is something that survived even into the more modern versions of the King James, and you can actually still buy modern versions of the King James that will have some of those alternate translations in them. For example, I have a little one here that's put out by Holman, and this one's copyright 2000. And in Acts 12:25, well, this is what Acts 12:25 says in the KJV. It says, "And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry, and took with them John, whose surname was Mark." And as a marginal note that goes along with it, where there's ministry, it says, "or charge." They fulfilled their ministry, or they fulfilled their charge. It's just another way of basically saying the same thing, but with a little bit different emphasis. And you can, like I said, you can still find KJVs that are printed like that, that have these little marginal notes that are translational. But there's also other marginal notes that you find in the 1611 KJV. In the 1611 KJV, in Acts 13, the last one was Acts 12:25, by the way. I think I said 13:25. I apologize for that. It's Acts 12:25 was the reference that I just gave. And Acts 13 in the 1611 KJV, in verse 18, the main text says this: "And about the time of 40 years suffered their manners in the wilderness." I like the way the KJV says it. Sometimes a lot of modern audiences don't get that, but that's actually kind of a funny statement. "Suffered their manners in the wilderness," the way that they did things. He put up with it. But in the marginal notes, it has alternate Greek renderings. One of the Greek renderings is "propapharesin," and the other one is "propapharesin." Did you catch that? It's a really minute difference, and it's the difference between pa and fa. Very, 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 very marginal difference, but it does change the meaning of the text. One that occurs in the main text is the idea of suffering their manners, suffering what they did, and the other one is to nurse or to feed. which is a very different kind of thing. And the KJV translator saw fit to include that alternate reading in the margin, and that's in the Greek. A lot of times KJV onlyists, especially the ones who like to call themselves King James Bible believers, will say, it's just the English text. We're not talking about the original languages, but the King James translators themselves went back to the original languages, to the source languages, and where they found differences that they thought were significant, they put them in the margin. And that's exactly what we have here. You have a marginal reading where there are two Greek words that are very, very, very similar. It could be one or the other, and they chose the one that seemed to make the best sense in that context, which is what we like to call textual criticism. You look at all the information that you have available to you, and you pick what makes the best sense in the context given, and that's what they went with. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't have been the other one in the absolute sense, though they included in a margin. Another interesting thing that King James onlyists really don't like is when people will take the text of Scripture and then they'll expound upon it using the Greek or the Hebrew or Aramaic, or sometimes some of the other languages like the Georgian and the Coptic and so on and so forth. King James onlyists really don't like that, especially a lot of the very fundamental, inspired in English kind of ones, especially the King James Bible believer group. And it's not really a continuous group, it's more of a continuum. There's variances in what they believe. But they generally do not like it when you expound upon something in terms of what the Greek means. Well, also, in the 1611, in Acts, where is it? It's still in Acts chapter 13 and verse 34. The main text says this: "And as concerning that he raised him up from the dead, now no more to return to corruption, he said on this wise, I will give you the sure mercies of David." And there's an interesting little marginal note when at that point. It talks about the Greek, and it gives the Greek word, and my copy is not all that great. I think it's tahasia. And it gives the literal translation of the word, which is holy or just things. And then it explains why they decided to translate it not as holy or just things, but as mercies. Where it says the mercies of David, this is that word. It doesn't actually literally mean mercies. It means literally holy or just things. But why did the KJV's translators translate it as mercies? This is great. I love this one. So they say it's literally holy or just things, which word the Septuagint, both in the place of Isaiah 55:3, that is Isaiah 55:3, and in many others, use for that which is in the Hebrew mercies. So why did they translate it that way? Because they know that it is typically used to translate a given Hebrew word that has that meaning. And how do they know that it's used to translate that Hebrew word? They looked at the Septuagint. I have talked with several King James onlyists who refuse to believe in the Septuagint, that it existed and that it had an impact on the New Testament. But that is not an argument or a belief that the King James translators themselves had. They looked at the text and said, well, this is a construction that we see in the Septuagint, and so we're going to use the Septuagint to try to understand how this actually works. And that's exactly what you have here. That's why that reading is that reading in Acts, 13 and 34. Acts 13:34 was a rendering that was based on the King James translators' understanding of the Septuagint. They understood that there were textual differences. They understood that the New Testament, a lot of times when it quotes the Old Testament, is based on the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew. And that in order to understand them, you have to be able to transfer back and forth and that kind of thing. And those are things that the King James translators, that the King James onlyists today really don't like. They don't like the fact that you can even get modern versions of the King James that still have marginal notes for alternate translations. They tend to turn a blind eye to the fact that their King James translation, as originally put out by the translators, included those marginal notes to a much more significant degree than you find in a lot of the modern translations of a lot of modern versions of the KJV. But not only that, they included alternate readings based on the original text in the Greek, specifically here in Acts chapter 13. And what was that? That was verse 18. And then they also give more information about why they translate things based on how things worked in the original languages, like they did in 1334. And these are the same things that the modern translations do that the King James Onlyists don't like, and that is giving alternate translations, saying where there's a manuscript difference or where there's a difference in the original language, or explaining things in terms of the original languages. These are things that a lot of KJV Onlyists don't like, but it's exactly what the King James translators did. Now, there are of course some King James Onlyists will say, well, it's not the original 1611 that we're worried about, you know, it's the pure Cambridge edition, it's the 1769 Laney edition, or whatever it happens to be, and all that kind of stuff. But the fact of the matter is that if you're going to argue for something that the King James translators themselves didn't argue for, and see fit to do and didn't believe, then you have a hopelessly self-contradictory argument. And frankly, that just kind of disturbs me that people would do that. The point of the matter is this: new translations have not left the King James translators and what they set forth as being appropriate within a translation. Providing footnotes is perfectly acceptable, whether it be translational notes, different ways to translate the same phrase, whether it be notes that talk about differences in the manuscript tradition and different words that could be there, even to include conjectural emendations, which do occur in the King James, by the way. Revelation 16:5 in the King James is based on Beza's conjectural emendation that he made in 1598, I believe it was. So you find conjectural emendations in the King James. And sometimes you find those in modern translations, not very often though. The vast majority of the main modern translations are based on main text translations rather than footnotes that contain conjectural emendations. The King James, on the other hand, it does have conjectural emendations in its main text. And the King James also included these notes that expound upon different words based on what it meant in the Greek and the Hebrew and the comparison between the two, and also on the basis of the Septuagint and things like that. These are all things that a lot of King James Onlyists don't like, but it's exactly what the King James translators did. And it's the same thing that a lot of modern translations do. And the reason why they did these kinds of things and they included all this marginalia and all these kinds of notes was simply because they believed in being honest with the text. If you read through the translators to the reader, there's one section in there where they say, very plainly, especially given the language that they're using in the time, they say that there are parts of the text that are unclear. And of course it doesn't impugn on any major core doctrine of Christianity as a whole, and we would still say that today, but they admit that there are some things that are not as certain, and in those kinds of cases it's good to have a marginal note. And they even go so far as to quote, I think it was Augustine, in saying that if something is uncertain, it's probably not best to dogmatize about it. And that is exactly what a lot of modern translations do. They say these are the areas where these things are uncertain, or where we've come across more historical evidence than we had before, and we know what the case is, and we know that we shouldn't be relying on this particular part of the text, so on and so forth. Everything that we do in translating, and I say me more in the distant sense because I'm not one of the translators, but I use modern translations, of course. But what they do, what they've done, is perfectly consistent with what the King James translators did. You might try to deny it, but the historical evidence is there that the King James translators were perfectly okay with this kind of marginalia, okay with going back to the original languages and drawing things out based on that and explaining the words more on that kind of a basis. Giving alternate readings where there are differences in the text, and also where things could be translated differently. And like I said, you can even find modern translations that'll do the same thing. And yeah, people can come up with all kinds of arguments against what I'm saying here, but the fact of the matter is that those differences did exist. They were set in place by the King James translators themselves, and the King James translators didn't have the few of the King James that King James onlyists today have. That's it. That's my main point. Anyways, thank you for taking the time to listen to this. Go with God and be blessed.